Thank you. So I'm doing an experiment and I will not have slides. So thank you to all the honorable and distinguished participants here today. It is truly an honor to speak with you. I am Gabrielle Dreyfus. I am the Chief Scientist with the Institute for Governance and Sustainable Development and an adjunct professor at Georgetown University. And my background is in reconstructing past climate change from Antarctic ice core records. I'm probably the only person you'll ever meet who spent time in a freezer in Antarctica. For the past 15 years, I've been working at the interface of science and policy in government and civil society. And there are three things that I would like you to remember from my remarks today, and that build on many of the themes we heard earlier this morning. The first is that we are facing not one, but two climate emergencies. This is where time, chronos, comes in. Second, nearly half of the global warming that we are experiencing from greenhouse gas emissions is due to super climate pollutants, including some of the air pollutants we just heard about, other than carbon dioxide. And third, to address both of these climate emergencies, we need our leaders and our institutions to take action to make deep cuts to both carbon dioxide and these other super climate pollutants, namely methane. Really critically, these actions are complementary and not interchangeable. They're also essential to protecting human rights and the natural systems on which we depend. So first, two climate emergencies. While most of the attention has been focused on the level of global warming at the end of the century, we saw this morning that the Paris target is for 2100. And there has been some progress in this regard. Projections based on current policies and commitments suggest that human-caused emissions of carbon dioxide from burning fossil fuels and cutting down forests put us on a path for warming of around 2.5 to 3 degrees Celsius by the end of the century. But this is compared with what was a 4-degree Celsius target or direction prior to the Paris Agreement. So I do want to recognize progress in this regard. And while 4 degrees Celsius, again from that Antarctic paleoclimate perspective, that's a mile-thick ice sheet if we were to go the opposite direction, would have been calamitous, even a warming of around 2.5 to 3 degrees would effectively place nearly a third of humanity outside of the corridor of life that has sustained civilization over the past 6,000 years. It's this end-of-century climate emergency that demands that we stop adding carbon dioxide to the atmosphere. So this is the time. This is the longer-term climate emergency. Because every ton of carbon dioxide that we emit is a legacy of committed warming for our children. This is the marathon that we are running now to free our economies from fossil fuel addiction. But there is another climate emergency that others have alluded to earlier today. This is the climate emergency that we are facing today. We are already experiencing the extreme heat waves, storms, floods, droughts of a changed climate. We saw graphs of billion-dollar disasters that are becoming more frequent, almost daily, extremes in India documented. And the billion-dollar disaster, these financial costs only hint at the human costs and the suffering as extreme weather, failed crops, and sea level rise drive tens of millions from their homes and fuel a global climate migration crisis. Fire season lasted a month or two when I was a child growing up in California. Now there are years where every month is fire season and smoke turns the sky orange. Indeed, experts in climate attribution science tell us that, quote, the current climate has changed so significantly that the pre-industrial world has become a poor basis of comparison, end quote. And this is with warming of only about 1.2 above pre-industrial levels. And we heard that under current warming rates, we are expected to pass 1.5 C within the next 10 years, possibly less. And because this warming threshold, the way the IPCC calculates when we pass 1.5 C, it looks at both the past 10 years and the projected next 10 years. And because there's strong evidence that the rate of warming is accelerating, we will have effectively passed that 1.5 C threshold by the time the 10-year average of past exceeds about 1.4 degrees C. Essentially, we're committed. And the 2018 special report by the IPCC and the more recent sixth assessment lay out starkly why every 1/10 of a degree of warming increases the severity and frequency of extreme climate and disaster risks. We also know that beyond 1.5 degrees, the risks of crossing irreversible tipping points in the climate system increases. Professor Lee gave us some examples of some of those irreversible tipping points this morning. If cutting carbon dioxide is the marathon we are running today to limit the climate emergency at the end of the century, then cutting methane and these other super climate pollutants is the sprint that we also need to be running this decade to slow warming. This is the climate emergency we're experiencing today. We have to slow down the rate of warming. And this brings me to my second point. Nearly half of today's warming is from greenhouse gases, is from the gases, the super climate pollutants other than carbon dioxide. So by super climate pollutants, I mean methane. It's the ground level ozone smog, some of what we were seeing from fluorinated gases and nitrous oxide. There's also black carbon soot, which isn't a greenhouse gas, but a particle that both contributes to warming and is a major air pollutant, a major constituent of that particle matter, that 2.5 particles that are causing such disease and premature mortality. So these pollutants are tens to thousands of times more potent than CO2 at trapping heat in our atmosphere. And the good news is that most of them are short-lived, meaning they only last for days to 15 years in the atmosphere. So if carbon dioxide is the slow burner, think of methane and the other super climate pollutants as a blowtorch that together are bringing our climate to a boil. According to the IPCC, carbon dioxide emissions are contributing about 0.8 degrees of present warming. These other super climate pollutants are contributing a similar level of warming, and here's the after lunch test. But that alone adds up to over 1.5, you might be thinking. And you're right. In addition to greenhouse gases, human activity creates particle pollution or aerosols like we just saw. And while some of these contribute to warming, like black carbon, others, like these sulfate aerosols, are reflective and have a cooling effect. And it's this cooling effect from these reflective aerosols that is masking some of the warming from these other greenhouse gases. And so we're not feeling the full effect of this blanket that Ram described this morning. And the main source of these cooling aerosols is the burning of fossil fuels. This means as we run the marathon to cut carbon dioxide by transitioning our economies, which we must, there will be less of these cooling aerosols and more warming will be en masse, accelerating the rate of warming at the same time as we need it to be going down. Which brings me to my third point. We have to tackle both of these climate emergencies, the climate emergency we are experiencing today and the end of century climate emergency. And to do this, we need our leaders and institutions. I'm a scientist. I like to think I have power. I don't. To take action and make deep cuts to both carbon dioxide and these other super climate pollutants. We can and we must bend down the temperature curve as soon and as quickly as possible to stay within the limits of the capacities of human and natural systems to adapt. The sprint to cut methane and the other superclimate pollutants is the best way we know to slow warming in the near term, while the marathon to phase out fossil fuels is the only way to limit warming in the longer term. Both of these strategies are essential, they are complementary, and they are not interchangeable. Cutting CO2 faster won't slow warming in the near term because of this sulfate unmasking effect. At the same time, if we only were to focus on cutting methane and the other superclimate pollutants without stopping CO2 emissions, that would lock in long-term warming. This is why we are in a dual race, 2 races at the same time, a sprint and a marathon. And the good news is that there are many mitigation options available that are low cost. We have renewable energy from solar and wind, plumbing essentially, plugging the leak from methane in the oil and gas sector, and using the Montreal Protocol that Ram alluded to this morning to speed a transition to energy efficient and climate-friendly cooling. The barriers to access are generally not a question of science or knowledge, but the laws and the policies that govern who gets to pollute and who pays for the impacts of that pollution. Thank you.